Fats Domino was never one for long speeches. Throughout his career, he let his piano do most of the talking. While others in the early days of rock and roll argued over titles, recognition, and legacies, Fats remained quiet, smiling behind the keyboard, sending audiences into a frenzy with just a rolling left hand and that unmistakable Creole rhythm. He was the gentle giant of the genre, the man whose music carried joy and soul into homes across America. Yet for decades, one question lingered in the background. What did he really think of Chuck Berry? The two were often placed side by side in the history books. Berry with his brash guitar riffs and swagger, Domino with his warm voice and infectious boogie. Reporters, historians, and fans speculated about whether they were rivals, friends, or simply respectful colleagues. For most of his life, Domino stayed silent. But just before his death, at 89 years old, he finally opened up, offering the world a glimpse into a story that rewrites what we thought we knew about the fathers of rock and roll. Before we dive into what Fats Domino finally revealed about Chuck Berry, we need to understand the man himself. Antoine Fats. Domino wasn't just another singer from the 1950s. He was one of the cornerstones of rock and roll. Born in 1928 in New Orleans, a city dripping with rhythm, culture, and soul, Domino was raised in a Creole family where French was spoken at home and music was a way of life. By the time he was a teenager, he was already dazzling crowds in local bars with his pounding piano style. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't a show-off, he was steady, warm, and endlessly musical. His sound was rooted in boogie-woogie and rhythm and blues. But when he sat at the keys, it transformed into something bigger, something that carried the DNA of what would soon be called rock and roll. Fats' rise to fame came in 1949 with The Fat Man, a song often credited as one of the very first rock and roll records. Long before Elvis made his first recordings, long before the world heard Chuck Berry's Maybelline, Fats Domino was already blending rhythm and blues with a faster beat, creating a sound teenagers couldn't resist. The record sold over 1 million copies, which was unheard of for an R&B artist at that time. He wasn't just popular, he was revolutionary. But unlike many of his peers, Domino never chased controversy or spectacle. He didn't need to duck-walk across the stage like Berry, or shake his hips like Elvis. His presence was enough. Standing at the piano in his signature suits, his wide grin lighting up the room, he exuded a kind of quiet power that made him one of the most beloved musicians of the era. His hits, like Blueberry Hill, Ain't That a Shame, and I'm Walkin', became part of the cultural fabric of America. By the end of his career, he had sold more than 65 million records, more than any other African-American rock artist of his time. Yet for all his success, Domino rarely sought the spotlight outside of music. He shied away from interviews, avoided the tabloids, and never seemed interested in claiming the crown of King of Rock and Roll, even though many argued he deserved it just as much as Elvis. This humility, though admirable, also meant his perspective on his peers, especially Chuck Berry, remained largely a mystery. The press loved to stir up rivalries, and while Berry often leaned into those debates, Domino's silence only deepened the intrigue. What did Fats really think about the man who strutted across the stage with a guitar, while he himself sat behind a piano building the foundation of the genre? Fans and critics alike speculated. Some assumed he must have resented Berry's boldness, while others believed he admired him, but chose not to say it publicly. For years, the truth remained buried beneath Domino's soft-spoken nature. But behind closed doors, among his bandmates and friends, there were hints, stories of encounters on tours, shows where both men performed, and moments where Domino's calm demeanor clashed with Barry's fiery personality. It would take nearly half a century for Fats to finally put words to those feelings. And when he did, it revealed far more than anyone expected. If Fats Domino was the gentle, smiling pianist who carried joy through his music, Chuck Berry was the opposite side of the same coin, a bold, fiery guitar slinger who embodied rebellion. Born in St. Louis in 1926, just 2 years before Domino, Berry grew up in a segregated America where opportunities for black musicians were slim. But Chuck had a plan. He wasn't just going to play music, he was going to dominate the stage and make himself impossible to ignore. His rise came in 1955 with Maybelline, a song that fused rhythm and blues with a country twang and an electrifying guitar riff that would become the blueprint for rock and roll. Where Fats sat calmly at his piano and let the rhythm speak, Chuck strutted across the stage, duck-walking, bending, and grinning at the audience while firing off riffs that no one had ever heard before. He was aggressive, witty, and unapologetically loud. His lyrics were filled with tales of cars, girls, and teenage dreams, things the youth of America connected with instantly. Songs like Johnny B. Good, Roll Over Beethoven, and Sweet Little 16 weren't just hits, they were cultural detonations, blasting through radio waves and declaring that a new era had arrived. Chuck wasn't just a musician, he was a performer who demanded attention. And unlike Fats, he thrived on being in the middle of every conversation about who truly invented rock and roll. Berry often leaned into these debates, famously saying more than once that he was the true originator of the genre. He liked being recognized as the man who brought teenage rebellion to the forefront, and while his confidence earned him praise, it also created tension among other pioneers who had been laying the foundation long before Maybelline topped the charts. While Berry's personality was often brash and confrontational, there was no denying his genius. He took the DNA of rhythm and blues and reshaped it with his guitar, creating a sound that influenced generations of players from Keith Richards to Jimi Hendrix. He was competitive, fiercely protective of his legacy, and sometimes difficult to work with. Stories of Chuck refusing to perform unless he was paid in cash up front became legendary. To promoters, he was a headache, but to fans, he was electric. And it was this bold personality that made the contrast with Fats Domino so fascinating. The two men, born just 2 years apart, were shaping the same musical revolution, but in very different ways. Fats embodied joy and musicality, while Chuck embodied rebellion and attitude. The press loved to play up this contrast, often painting Berry as the rebel and Domino as the gentleman. But behind the scenes, the truth was far more complicated. Each man admired the other, but their differences in style, temperament, and approach created a tension that the music industry never stopped fueling. And while Berry seemed happy to speak his mind about his role in history, Domino kept his thoughts locked away for decades, until finally, at 89 years old, he decided it was time to say what he truly thought about the man who strutted with the guitar while he sat at the piano. As the 1950s unfolded, rock and roll exploded like wildfire across America, and the media, eager to create stories of competition, began painting pictures of rivalries between the artists who defined the sound. Elvis Presley was crowned the king. Little Richard was labeled the wild showman. And somewhere in the middle sat Fats Domino and Chuck Berry, two men who had little in common stylistically, but who found themselves constantly compared in the press. On the surface, Fats and Chuck rarely clashed directly. They were professionals, each focused on their craft, But beneath the polite smiles was an undeniable tension fueled by record labels, promoters, and journalists who wanted to anoint one as the true father of rock and roll. Barry never shied away from this narrative. He often positioned himself as the originator, arguing that his style and songwriting set the standard for the genre. He was bold in interviews, declaring that without his riffs and teenage-focused lyrics, rock would not exist. Fats Domino, on the other hand, remained quiet. But that quietness should not be mistaken for weakness. To those who knew him, Fats was fully aware of his influence. Long before Maybelline hit the charts in 1955, Fats had already sold millions with The Fat Man in 1949 and had become a dominant figure in rhythm and blues. He didn't need to argue. He let the record sales and the packed concert halls speak for themselves. But the music industry thrived on conflict, and comparisons between the two men only grew. Promoters loved booking them on the same bills, hoping to fuel the fire and sell more tickets. Stories began circulating of backstage disputes, of Chuck demanding to close shows because he believed no one could follow his act, only for promoters to insist that Domino finish the night because his music kept audiences dancing until the very end. This created friction, subtle but powerful, and though Domino rarely responded publicly, those close to him said he didn't appreciate Barry's arrogance. Still, he never let it show. Instead, he remained dignified, continuing to record hit after hit, as if proving his point through music alone. Meanwhile, Barry leaned into his competitive streak, sometimes taking jabs at his peers during interviews, stoking debates about who truly invented rock and roll. For the public, these rivalries became part of the myth, adding drama to the rise of the genre. For Domino, however, it was simply noise, something he didn't want to feed. Yet even in his silence, the tension was felt. Fans wanted to know, did Fats feel overshadowed by Chuck's bold claims? Did he resent the way Barry positioned himself as the founder, while Domino, the man who had hits years earlier, stayed in the background? For decades, Fats kept those answers to himself, guarding his thoughts like secrets. But what no one knew was that he had strong opinions about Barry, opinions that he wouldn't fully reveal until he reached the twilight of his life. As rock and roll grew from a regional sound into a global force, Fats Domino and Chuck Berry often found themselves sharing the same stages, festivals, and television appearances. On paper, it was a promoter's dream, two of the hottest acts in America together in one lineup. But behind the curtain, there was often tension that few fans ever saw. Members of Domino's band later recalled that Chuck Berry had a habit of making bold demands before shows. One of his most notorious was insisting that he close the concert, arguing that no one could follow the fire and energy of his guitar-driven act. He believed his duck walk, his flamboyant solos, and his connection with teenage fans made him the inevitable headliner. But more often than not, promoters disagreed. They understood that while Barry could ignite a crowd, it was Fats Domino who left audiences dancing until the very end. His music had a universal appeal that brought people together, from teenagers to older fans, black and white alike. And so, in many cases, it was Domino who closed the night, sending the crowd home with Blueberry Hill or I'm Walkin' ringing in their ears. This was not something Barry took lightly. According to those who were there, his frustration was clear. He saw himself as the rightful king of the stage, yet time and again he had to watch Domino command the finale slot. For Fats, it was never about ego. It was simply about giving the audience what they wanted. But for Chuck, every slight, every denied request felt like a challenge to his reputation. There were also stories of uneasy interactions between the two men off stage. While Fats was easygoing, known for his humility and warmth, Barry was guarded, calculating, and sometimes combative. At after-parties, Domino would often sit quietly, chatting with friends or playing piano for fun, while Barry was more likely to be negotiating pay with promoters, watching carefully to ensure he wasn't being cheated, or boasting about his role in shaping the music. These differences in personality made their relationship more complicated than fans could imagine. It wasn't that they openly disliked each other. There was always a baseline of professional respect, but there was a competitive edge in the air, sharpened by the industry and fueled by pride. What's more, the racial climate of the 1950s added another layer to the rivalry. Both men were African-American artists achieving unprecedented crossover success in a segregated America. Yet the press often tried to pit them against each other instead of celebrating the fact that both were breaking barriers side by side. Some journalists even fanned the flames by asking Barry what he thought of Domino's popularity, or asking Domino how he felt about Barry calling himself the originator of rock. Domino usually brushed off such questions with a smile, never giving reporters the juicy sound bites they craved. But within his circle, he made it clear that while he respected Barry's talent, he knew his own worth. He didn't need to shout it. He had been there first, cutting million-selling records before Barry had even stepped into a studio. To those who paid attention, his silence wasn't submission. It was quiet confidence. But for decades, fans were left guessing, wondering if Fats's calm demeanor masked resentment or admiration. That mystery lingered for years, until, near the end of his life, Fats finally opened up, confirming what many had long suspected, but never heard from his own lips. For all the tension that surrounded their careers, Fats Domino and Chuck Berry shared something that went deeper than rivalry: an unspoken, mutual respect. It might not have always shown itself in headlines or interviews, but within the music community, both men acknowledged the other's place in history. Domino, in particular, was generous with his praise. He was once quoted as saying, "Chuck Berry is a great man," a short and simple statement, but one that carried weight, given how rarely Fats commented on others. To Fats, Berry was not just another act competing for the spotlight, but a true innovator whose guitar playing had changed the direction of popular music. And despite Berry's reputation for being fiercely competitive and often dismissive of his peers, he too admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that Domino's piano style had shaped the rhythmic backbone of rock. Several musicians who worked with Berry over the years recalled him acknowledging that he had learned timing and rhythm by studying New Orleans records Fats Domino had made famous. That didn't mean the two men were close friends. In fact, they lived in different worlds. Fats remained tied to New Orleans, deeply connected to his roots, while Berry was more nomadic, always on the road, always performing, often in pursuit of the next paycheck. But whenever they shared a stage, no matter how much the promoters or the press tried to pit them against each other, there was an understanding between them that only pioneers of the same revolution could share. They knew the struggles of being black entertainers in a segregated era, of having to fight for fair pay, of playing to audiences divided by ropes that separated white and black fans. They both knew the sting of having their contributions overshadowed by white artists who covered their songs and reaped greater commercial rewards. This common experience forged a bond, even if it was never openly celebrated. And while Berry liked to call himself the originator, he never denied that Fats had been there first, making million-selling records before rock even had a name. Domino, for his part, never boasted about it. His humility kept him from throwing his influence in people's faces. But when asked privately, he would remind people gently, "I was playing that music before they had a name for it." This wasn't arrogance, it was fact. Both men understood that their rivalry was often exaggerated by outsiders who thrived on drama, but the respect that lay underneath was real. In their own ways, they admired one another, even if pride and personality kept them from saying it often. And when Domino finally spoke in his last years, it wasn't to tear Barry down, but to acknowledge him honestly, with both admiration and subtle correction, making it clear that the story of rock and roll was bigger than one man's claim to being the founder. For decades, fans wondered what Fats Domino really thought about Chuck Berry, and the answer didn't come until late in his life. At 89 years old, frail but sharp, Fats gave one of his final interviews where the subject of Berry inevitably came up. This time, instead of dodging the question with a smile, he finally spoke openly. He called Berry loud, proud, and one of the greatest showmen who ever lived. A rare moment of public admiration. But then Fats added something that quietly shifted the conversation. "People say Chuck started rock and roll," he said softly, "but I was playing it before they had a name for it." It was not said with bitterness, nor with anger, but with quiet assurance, as if Domino was gently correcting history without trying to diminish Berry's role. Those words carried the weight of truth, spoken by a man who had nothing left to prove. By then, his legacy was cemented. But in that moment, he wanted to remind the world that rock's story didn't start with Chuck Berry alone. It began with a movement, with rhythm and blues, with piano players in New Orleans clubs, and with a young man named Fats Domino, who had already sold millions before Berry had even made his first hit. As the years went on, both men lived very different final chapters, yet their legacies remained inseparable. Chuck Berry continued performing almost until the end of his life, often still demanding to be paid in cash before stepping on stage, his stubbornness intact even in his 80s. He released his final album at age 90, a testament to his undying need to stay in the spotlight. Fats Domino, on the other hand, chose a quieter life. After Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005, fans feared he had been lost in the flood, but he was later rescued from his home, refusing to leave the city he loved. From then on, Domino largely stayed out of the public eye, living peacefully in his neighborhood, surrounded by family and friends. He rarely performed, but whenever he did appear, he was greeted like royalty, a reminder of how beloved he remained. Even in silence, his influence was everywhere. Younger generations rediscovered his music, and his role in shaping rock and roll was acknowledged more openly than ever before. For both Berry and Domino, their twilight years were marked by reflection. One still restless and commanding, the other serene and content. Yet despite their differences, their names were always linked together, as if history itself refused to separate the piano man and the guitar rebel. In the end, Fats Domino's late-life words about Chuck Berry carried more weight than any rivalry ever could. By finally speaking, he reminded the world that rock and roll was never the work of one man alone. Chuck Berry may have been the rebel with the guitar, strutting across stages with unmatched confidence, but Fats Domino had already been there, shaping the sound.